Welcome to the All Things Financial podcast. I'm Yelisey Coots, and Trey Peterson is joining me today. We're going to be talking about the billion-dollar wedding industry. Your love might be priceless, but everything else related to this industry is not. We're going to talk about the expenses and how they relate to retirement on this episode of the billion-dollar wedding industry.
Welcome to All Things Financial, Trey Peterson and Yelisey Coots. Today we're talking about something kind of interesting, the billion-dollar wedding industry. And really, even though we're kind of titled that, really what we're talking about is as you are in and preparing for retirement, what things you need to be thinking about the same way or differently when it comes to big expenses. You know, even this year we've had people that go, hey, my daughter's about to get married. I'm going to give $10,000 towards that or $20,000 or more. What's the best way to do that? I think our goal today is to cover different types of big expenses. We're going to talk a little bit more about the wedding industry because it's so significant. And we're seeing a lot of our clients paying for weddings or at least portion of weddings. And what does that look like?
Yeah, I got to say, when our producer first gave us the topic, I'm like, are they trying to throw us for a loop? But then I thought back, like, how many conversations have we had this year alone, even in the last couple of weeks, with clients that are faced with paying for a wedding, and not like they're doing it, reluctantly, but that's a huge expense that they have to deal with. Or in some cases, some of our clients are getting married in retirement. We've had a number of clients who've either lost a spouse or unfortunately through divorce or whatever the circumstances, but they're getting remarried in retirement for whatever reason. And it is a significant expense, and it's a growing expense. And there's a number of factors that are kind of making it more of a retirement topic than I think most of us would think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, if you're married, you almost always marry your opposite. So a lot of times what happens is a couple will come in, and I'll just give an example, and Julie will say, hey, it's my dream to pay for our daughter's wedding. And Jim will say, that's nice. It's my dream to buy them a nice gift. So also, what does it look like to negotiate with your spouse and how you help? And do you actually know the true cost? I think one of the things that we'll get into is those numbers is it may cost you $10,000 to help your son or daughter out today, but over your retirement, that $10,000 might be $30,000 or $40,000 that's missing down the road.
Exactly.
And so, what does compounding interest do? So what is the cost of that gift? And one of the things I love is that we're both generous, but we also think about things as how do we make sure that we're helping you be generous, but also make sure that you're going to be okay in retirement? Because one of the things I like to say is that you can borrow money for a lot of things. You can borrow money to buy a car. You can borrow money to purchase a new home or a second home. You can borrow money to start a business, but nobody will borrow you money to fund your retirement.
That's true. That's true. And actually, unfortunately, as parents, we want to help our kids. And I'm not even talking in the context of helping for a wedding, but just in general. How many parents do we have who've given their child a loan or something and expecting to receive it in 5 or 10 years? And unfortunately, that child isn't in a position where they can pay them back. If you're giving that money as a loan, just assume that it's a gift. And if you can afford the gift, then consider it.
Yeah. Don't loan anything that you can't afford to give away.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think a couple of things that are interesting, we'll get into this, is people are getting later today than they used to. Right? A lot of people are spending time finding careers, getting focused on who they are before they find a spouse. And not only are people delaying getting married, but people are spending more money on weddings than ever before.
Yeah. So here in Minnesota, we're actually ranked 21st in the country in terms of how much in terms of the wedding industry here in our state. And we're at $972 million in terms of the cost. And that's related obviously to vendors, to people who provide food, to everything but we have a whole list of all the things that go into a wedding, from photography to catering to your wedding dress and everything else that goes into that. So we're kind of right in the middle of the country. So we're going to use some of the stats here in Minnesota. But as a nation, on average, in 1975, about 50 years ago, right? Actually, exactly 50 years ago, about half of young adults from the age of 25 to 34 had already moved out of their parents' home. They were already working, and they were married, and they had children. That's in 1945, 50 years ago. Today, 25% of adults are in that same position. So things have changed statistically, right? People are taking a little bit longer to do some of these normal things that most of us thought were kind of, hey, that's just what you do. This is the order of things. We're 50 years later taking a little bit longer to do that. And that's kind of leading into this discussion and why this becomes a retirement conversation. So if people are taking longer to get married and also taking longer to have children, there's a good chance that if you're approaching your retirement years, your children are probably considering getting married at that time, just based on how the numbers pan out. The average age of having your first child is 27 and a half.
That's how old I was.
Yeah, so if you're 27 and a half, having your
first average.
Yeah, you're just below actually. Yeah, but it turns out, so if you're 27 and a half, having your first kid, and on average people get married in their 30s, in their early 30s, well, there you go. That's 60 years, and that's why you're carving out a chunk of your retirement. You might not look at it as a chunk of your retirement in your 30s and 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
But if you're 60 years old, everything is considered through the lens of retirement because your working years are kind of, behind you at that point.
Well, let's summarize it this way. So if you are in and nearing retirement, so let's say you're 55 plus years old, I think one of the goals that most people have, and I think this is related to weddings, is you want to pay for that home remodel. You want to pay your car off, ideally your home off, a lot of situations around that. But you want to get those big expenses out of the way while you still have income.
Yeah.
That way in retirement, you're not taking chunks of what you've spent decades saving and working for and watching grow in the market to pay something off that now it cost you 30 years of growth. One of those areas is weddings. So because people are waiting longer to get married, parents are being asked for money oftentimes right at retirement, right before or right after.
Right.
And I think that's where, as far as preparing for retirement, it's one of those things where if you've got 3 kids and they need $10,000 or $15,000 a piece, now you're talking about potentially $45,000, which over a 20-year period is, you ran some numbers. Share some of those if you don't mind.
Yeah. So in 2024, we had over 28,000 weddings, and this is from the Wedding Report. They do a ton of statistics on this. Almost everyone who's a vendor in the wedding industry, at least here in Minnesota, they rely on a lot of these numbers to help them in terms of their economics. But on average, most people spent $34,139 for their wedding and every wedding-related expense in 2024. Now, obviously, that can go up quite a bit. Typically, what influences that is the type of venue that you have, which typically accounts for more than 50% of the cost, but also the number of guests that you have. For every additional guest, it's about $220 roughly per guest when you consider wedding favors and obviously the cost of catering and everything else. Now, I had the benefit of having a COVID wedding. It was amazing. You could just cut half the guest list and you didn't even have to offer an explanation.
The Lord did that all for you.
For me, yeah. Actually, it was a very stressful time because, every week as we were getting closer to my actual wedding date, they would change the requirements, right? They would say, hey, now you can have this many guests. Now you can have food vendors. You can actually have more than this number of people in a specific room. You didn't have to separate people. So it was a very stressful time to get married, but it did save a buck or two on some of the things.
Yeah. So you've got a wedding. You're going to help pay for it. What are some of the different ways that somebody could help pay for that wedding? Give us some ideas and options.
So I would say whenever a client comes in and they ask us that question, what they're really asking is the same question we get all the time. Where do I draw from first? Whether it's a wedding or some other major expense, they want to know what the most tax efficient way, from which account to pull from. Do I pull from pre-tax, after tax? And there's a lot of different variety of accounts there. But I would say that there's a couple of things that go into it. So you can gift up to $19,000. That's the annual gift tax exclusion. Everybody can do that. You can do that per beneficiary, so per person, right? So if you wanted to give something to your daughter or your son, you can give them $19,000, and your spouse can also give them $19,000. So it's actually a quite a sizable gift, and as long as you don't exceed $19,000 in a specific year, there are no reporting requirements on that, and it doesn't go against your lifetime gift exclusion. So people are often wondering, hey, do I have to pay taxes when I give this gift? Does the person who's receiving the money, do they need to pay taxes? And the answer is no in most cases. However, if you've exceeded the $13.9 million lifetime annual gift tax exclusion in 2025, at that point, yes, there could be tax implications. And really on any gift given over that amount right now in 2025, the tax rate is 40%. So in other words, don't give more than roughly $14 million and you should be okay. But that's a federal limit.
I'm so glad you told me that today.
For all of our listeners
tomorrow
and the overwhelming majority of our clients who have to deal with this, yes, it's 40% over that.
Yeah.
that
So I mean, the
amount.
Clarification is a lot of people are concerned, hey, what's the gifting? I can only gift up to, what is it?
Yeah, $19,000 this year.
$19,000, right?
Yeah.
So if they give 25, it's not an issue.
So it's not an issue if they give more than $19,000. The only issue is they have to report that, right? So any gift over $19,000,
The receiver has to report it.
No, it actually goes against your actual gift exclusion amount. So you're allowed to give $13.9 million over the course of your lifetime. So you're basically slowly chipping away at that number with the number of gifts that you've given above $19,000 in 2025. Okay. So the chances, so if you gave $25,000, but you're never going to exceed $13.9 million, then there's never going to be a gift tax issue. at least on the federal level. Now, on the state side, every state is going to be completely different. Like in Minnesota, it's $3 million per person, and it's not portable. Like you can't combine the two amounts if you're married.
So give us an example. If somebody inherits $5 million in Minnesota, federally tax-free, but not state-wise.
Not state-wise. So like I said, on the federal level, if your gifts exceed $13.9 million or your estate exceeds that, then you're taxed at 40%. Here in Minnesota, I believe it's between 13 and 16% of the amount that exceeds $3 million. So obviously a much smaller rate, but also a much smaller dollar amount in terms of gifting. So sometimes, people are just surprised, right? When they count up everything they have, right? Whenever they pass away, maybe you don't have $3 million sitting in your Schwab or your Fidelity account, but when you factor in everything you have, your entire estate, sometimes you're coming up on those numbers a little bit unexpectedly, and your estate would have to pay that tax. And, on average, most weddings are right around $30,000, $35,000. That's the average cost. So what we did is, and we pulled together some numbers, and what would it look like if you decided at the age of 60 just to gift $30,000? Of course, you don't want to exceed the $19,000 limit. So both you and your spouse, you give $15,000 each to your daughter who's getting married. So you're basically saying we're taking $30,000 out of our retirement plan, whether it's pre-tax or after tax. We're giving up $30,000. Not only are you losing $30,000, that $30,000 will no longer be growing on your behalf. So we look to see what is the actual cost? What's the opportunity cost? So imagine over 20 years, you earned an average rate of 6%. That $30,000 would be closer to $96,000. So $100,000. Now I know none of us really think that way. Whenever we give somebody a gift, whenever you give somebody a birthday gift, you're not considering all the opportunity cost, right? You're just giving them that gift. But in reality, when you're approaching those years, it's important to think in that way because you might not have the time to make it back. Right. So that's kind of one of the things that we looked at. Consider how much you're actually losing over the scope of your retirement over that period.
Yeah, good. One of the things I like is you broke down wedding costs by category.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is that the wedding venue was like 56 or 58% of the cost. And so what I thought about is, man, if I was looking for a way to cut my expenses, you can have everything, but if you change the venue or find a venue that maybe is priced more favorably, you could save a significant amount.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was over 50% on that. So yeah, it's, the venue's obviously a big cost. So, and then the other thing that comes into it, people often wonder, if I give something from my IRA, well, can I just transfer those shares over? I don't want to pay the taxes. Do I really need to pull the money out? If you take it out of your IRA or your pre-tax account, you can't just transfer shares to your beneficiary. Mm-hmm. You actually have to take a distribution. You have to introduce taxable income. So that income will be taxable on your tax return. And then you can give the money that you have or the proceeds to your beneficiaries and no taxable implications after that. However, if you have like an after-tax account, like an individual account, a joint account where an account that has a cost basis, certainly you can go the same route as the IRA. You can sell the shares, you can sell the positions, and potentially you could face taxes yourself and then give them the proceeds. Or you could just simply transfer the positions into their account. And what would happen is they would inherit your basis. So whatever your basis was, if you bought the Apple stock here and it's worth that much, only when they sell the Apple stock that you now transferred into their account would they have to pay taxes on the gain. So that could be one way where you can actually avoid the tax liability for yourself. And maybe that's the best way to do it. So if you have like highly appreciated stock where you're like, gosh, if I sell that stock, I'm going to take a tax hit.
Especially if you're in a higher tax bracket than that son or daughter of yours.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way to do it. That's how a lot of people transfer money to charities and different things too. But yeah, I mean, that's that, so if you're asking me like, hey, go through my accounts and tell me what I should send over. Well, if you can transfer shares, highly appreciated shares in an after-tax account. And if your son or daughter, if they happen to be in a much lower tax bracket, it's not like they have to sell it, but if that's like their only source of income, you transfer it over. And then when they sell the shares, the gain is theirs. And potentially, depending on how long you've held that position and how much taxable income they have, they could be taxed anywhere between 0 and 20% on that.
So if you have a son or a daughter that's got a wedding coming up, another area that you can plan for that is if you're pulling from an account that hopefully is appreciated. One of the things that we've had, especially with people that maybe they're spending 10 or more thousand, is instead of pulling from that account all in one year, if they can plan to pull out a portion this year and a portion next year, they might be able to pay less taxes on some of that money.
Yeah.
Will you share some examples on that?
Yeah, and another thing that is kind of related to this too is, sometimes people wonder like, and it's not just because there's a wedding or some type of expense, but we have a lot of people who come in and say, hey, I don't necessarily want to give this away when I've passed away. I want to be able to see what my beneficiaries do with it. I want to see who's more responsible, who's going to spend everything, or I just want to be able to see them enjoy it a little bit, right? So that's one of the implications of giving something away while you're alive or after you've passed away. So on those after-tax accounts, as I mentioned with the stock, right, your basis would transfer over to them. They would have to pay taxes on the entire gain, just like you would, just at their own rates. But if you pass away and then they receive it by inheritance, they receive a step up in basis. In other words, the government's going to look at that and say, hey, you bought the Apple stock here. It's worth this much. We're going to pretend that never happened. We're going to look at the value at the date of death, and that becomes the new basis for the beneficiaries. In other words, they can sell it the day after they receive it, the day after the date of death, assuming that they've already received the proceeds, and there wouldn't be any taxable gain.
Yeah.
So that would be one of the things where you can provide a little pushback and say, well, it depends on a couple of things, but obviously once you pass away, that would be the most tax efficient time for them to receive the proceeds, especially on things that have low cost basis, high gain.
Yeah.
Might not be everything that you have, but at least on those types of positions.
Some of the other interesting costs, 5.1% of weddings on attire and accessories, 1.8% on bakery. It seems like a really low number. Have you seen some of the costs of some of these cakes these days?
It's insane.
It's insane.
Yeah, we actually, my family's kind of in the Russian community here. My wife is from Belarus. I'm from Ukraine, as many of you know. So we actually have, there's a whole wedding industry just in that community, and it's also insane. So I know you had some folks that helped out with your venue and some of the catering, or
man, I'm so thankful. So when we got married at our church.
Yeah,
turns out my dad's the pastor of that church, so that was really helpful.
Yeah, so he didn't cut you any breaks.
Didn't cut me any breaks. We did what all the members do. We just paid the maintenance, cleaning cost, or whatever that was. Our wedding reception we had at Mystic Lake Casino in Prior Lake. And I'm really thankful. We had a family friend that was on the board, and he got us a 25% discount. And then after we got that discount, they took it away for all non-natives because we weren't supposed to have it. So I think one of the things, though, is it's just like anything. I think that you have an idea of what you want, but also look around, knock on doors, because you can save. Saving 25% of where we had our reception was significant.
Yeah. You know me, I'm like nickel and diming everything. I'm trying to, because I know it's all going to add up. So I'm doing my best to save every dollar I can. And mine ended up being very close to the averages, just under. You know? So it's like, it is a significant expense. And I think this is where you and I differ. You would probably say, hey, it's okay to spend more money on such a significant day in your life. Like this should be the moment to remember.
Yeah,
meanwhile, some people have the perspective of like, hey, some of this money could like actually help us get started in life. So if you're a young person, you're wondering, do I put more money down on the house down payment? Do I help prepare for like, hey, if we're just about to get ready to have children, do I help give myself a bit of a head start in that area? Or do we just blow it all on the wedding day? Or maybe there's an answer somewhere in between.
No, you got to be responsible, right?
Yeah.
And I think that preferences are in relation to responsibility.
Yeah.
So you can't say like my preference is that we take everything that we have, we blow it on a wedding, and then we don't have money for an emergency savings.
Yeah.
Like that's insane. However, we see people do that. I would say that most of the time, women care more about stability and security more than they do a nicer car, a nicer house, whatever. So I would say once you're making responsible decisions, then you just decide what are our preferences. And like you and like me, we typically marry our opposite. So then the next thing is, what is our preference? Is more of this money for a big day in our lives? Or do we do nothing nice and we have more money sitting in savings for an account that, maybe it's towards something or maybe it's just for peace of mind. But that's where preferences come in.
Yeah. People do marry their opposites, and there's a lot of differences in the preferences, especially on something that big. And we see that in our, in different types of expenses in retirement. We have some clients that are much more conservative. They'd rather see their assets grow in their portfolio. And then maybe they're married to somebody who'd rather take a few more vacations because maybe they're in their go-go years and they're saying, hey, we're in our 60s. We're about to enter the slow-go years or the no-go years, as you've put it before. So yeah, there's different preferences on those types of things. And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. I think a lot of it's just based on the type of person you are and just like you said, preference.
Yeah. I think too, it's kind of like we're going to be talking about, is money a positive thing or a negative thing? My mom grew up in a trailer park and money was always a negative topic. And so for her, like, there's never enough to be saved. And anytime my dad buys something new, even still in her late 50s, her natural response is like, how long are we going to have this nice thing before it gets taken away? Because she grew up with, a dad that bought nice things and they were taken away because then he didn't pay for them.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we're going to talk about is how do you change your relationship with money, and what does that look like so that for you, money can be a positive thing, not a negative thing.
Yeah. When you guys were planning your wedding, any personal stories where you guys disagreed on the type of expense or anything that?
Yeah, I think it's just like anything. Is my dad, like they gave us we didn't know that they were going to give us anything, and they gave us $10,000 towards our wedding. And I think we ended up spending, I don't know, $26,000 on our wedding. So they gave us 10 and we covered, the other 16. So not including Steph's wedding dress. So we were probably around $30,000. But I think for us, it was good that my dad just said, hey, I want to give you $10,000, because there were things that we did that he would have said, videography isn't important to him. Well, it was to us.
Right.
So I think it was wise in that, especially if you're giving money and there's an in-law, which if you're giving money and your son or daughter's getting married, there are differences on where you would spend money.
Yeah.
So I think one of the ways to have great relationships is to say, hey, we want to give you this amount, whatever you spend it on, this is your day.
Man, that's such an important thing. So like to any of our retirees, any of our clients who might be listening, if you're helping to fund the wedding for your son or daughter-in-law or son-in-law, whatever, give the money without any strings attached. Because I think that's maybe the biggest complaint. And also, like, people are just crazy on wedding day. Not necessarily wedding day, but the whole wedding process. Like, we've talked to a number of people where it's like, hey, we had a great relationship with our daughter-in-law, but that whole wedding day, wedding process, it just like brings out the worst in people, because people definitely want it their way. So I think one of the best things to do, if you're giving money, if you're helping them, no strings attached. That's the way to do it.
That's the way to do it for sure. One of the things I'd recommend is deciding what areas you want excess and what areas the basics are okay. And so one of the things, like I've told Steph, is I said, some people live like nothing's important and they want the cheapest of everything. And others live like everything's important and they spend the most on everything. What I want to do is I want to live by saying, here are areas of our life that matter. So like for me, transportation, right? Like a lot of people would say, I don't need a nice car, it just gets me from point A to point B. Well, it's like for me, like I want to get me from point A to point B in a way that brings me the most joy possible. So I like having a quality vehicle. I like something that drives fast. I had a friend, I'll never forget, that even getting started, he was like, man, he's like, you have a nice car for just getting started. And I said, yeah, but let me ask you something. How much do you spend on golf, hunting, and alcohol? And he was like, oh, man, probably $15,000 a year. And I said, well, I don't do any of those things. I drive a nice car. And so one of the things I would just say to people is find out what matters most to you and spend money on that. It doesn't have to be on everything.
With that, I think it's a great place to end.
Thank you for joining us.
Advisory services are offered through CG Advisory Services, LLC, a registered investment advisor, and through Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor. CG Advisory Services, LLC, and Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, are separate and unaffiliated entities. The topics discussed on this podcast are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be investment advice or recommendations. Listeners should consult with their own financial professionals before making any investment decisions.